The intersection between ancient Hermetic philosophy and modern depth psychology represents one of the most compelling, yet often misunderstood convergences in the history of Western thought. The observer finds in this confluence not merely a superficial alignment of mystical and psychological vocabularies, but rather a profound structural resonance between two distinct systems of understanding the human condition. To navigate this territory requires both intellectual rigor and historical precision, qualities often obscured by the sensationalist appropriations that have characterized popular treatments of both traditions. The Kybalion, published in 1908 by the enigmatic authors known collectively as the Three Initiates, purports to transmit the essential teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage of ancient Egypt. Carl Jung, working independently in the early 20th century, developed a revolutionary framework for understanding the psyche that drew heavily upon alchemical, Gnostic, and esoteric traditions. That these two bodies of work emerged within decades of each other is no mere coincidence. Both represent responses to a particular crisis in Western consciousness, a crisis precipitated by the disenchantment of the modern world. Before examining the philosophical content of the Kybalion, one must address the question of its historical authenticity. The text claims to represent ancient Egyptian wisdom transmitted through Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic deity combining the Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth. Scholarly consensus, however, places the actual Hermetic literature in Hellenistic Egypt, primarily between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. The Kybalion itself belongs to an entirely different historical moment, emerging from the New Thought movement in early 20th century America. This historical displacement need not invalidate the text's philosophical merit, but it demands intellectual honesty. The Kybalion is not an ancient document but a modern synthesis, drawing upon genuine Hermetic themes while filtering them through the lens of American metaphysical thought. The actual corpus hermeticum, particularly texts like the Poimandres and the Asclepius, presents a markedly different cosmology and theological framework than what one encounters in the Kybalion's 7 principles. The text's authorship remains deliberately obscured. Most scholars attribute it to William Walker Atkinson, a prolific New Thought writer who published under numerous pseudonyms. This attribution finds support in stylistic analysis and thematic continuity with Atkinson's other works. The decision to publish anonymously as Three Initiates served multiple purposes. It created an aura of mystery, suggested initiatory knowledge, and aligned the text with the Western esoteric tradition's emphasis on concealment and gradual revelation. Jung's relationship to Hermetic thought presents a different sort of complexity. Unlike the Kybalion's authors, Jung engaged extensively with original Hermetic and alchemical texts, studying them in their historical and linguistic contexts. His major work on alchemy, Mysterium Coniunctionis, demonstrates profound scholarly engagement with primary sources, yet Jung's reading of these texts was decidedly psychological rather than metaphysical. He sought in alchemy and Hermeticism symbolic representations of psychic processes, not literal descriptions of cosmic laws. This methodological difference proves crucial. The Kybalion presents itself as revealing objective principles governing reality itself. Jung, by contrast, approached esoteric traditions as projections of the collective unconscious, valuable precisely because they illuminate psychological structures rather than external metaphysical truths. This distinction between ontological and psychological interpretation runs throughout any comparison of these two systems. The Kybalion organizes its teaching around 7 fundamental principles: mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. Each principle warrants careful philosophical scrutiny. The principle of mentalism states that the all is mind, the universe is mental. This axiom presents reality as fundamentally idealistic, suggesting that matter derives from consciousness rather than the reverse. Philosophically, this aligns with various forms of absolute idealism, particularly those found in German philosophy from Fichte through Hegel. However, the Kybalion's formulation lacks the systematic rigor of these philosophical systems. It asserts rather than argues, presenting mentalism as revealed truth rather than reasoned conclusion. From a Jungian perspective, the principle of mentalism becomes psychologically interesting, not as a metaphysical claim, but as an expression of psychic primacy. Jung recognized that human beings inevitably experience reality through consciousness, that all knowledge of the external world is mediated by psychic processes. The assertion that all is mind might then be understood as acknowledging this phenomenological fact. We know only our representations of reality, never reality independent of consciousness. Yet Jung carefully distinguished this epistemological position from metaphysical idealism, refusing to claim that psychic reality is the only reality. The principle of correspondence, encapsulated in the famous axiom, as above, so below, as below, so above, suggests a fundamental symmetry between different levels of reality. This principle has deep roots in Hermetic and Neoplatonic thought, reflecting the idea that the cosmos exhibits structural homology across scales. The microcosm mirrors the macrocosm. The individual soul reflects the world soul. Jung found this principle extraordinarily fruitful, though again he psychologized it. His concept of synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence of inner and outer events, represents one application of correspondence thinking. More fundamentally, Jung's entire approach to symbolism rests on the idea that external symbols correspond to internal psychic realities. The alchemical process of transforming base metal into gold corresponds to the psychological process of individuation, the integration of unconscious contents into consciousness. Yet Jung insisted on a crucial distinction. Correspondence for him was not a mystical law governing the universe, but a way consciousness organizes experience. The psyche naturally thinks in analogies and parallels. It perceives patterns and relationships, often projecting internal structures onto external phenomena. The Hermetic principle captures something true about how consciousness operates, without necessarily describing an objective feature of reality independent of mind. The principle of vibration posits that nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. This principle attempts to ground Hermetic philosophy in what appears to be a scientific observation about the nature of matter and energy. The Kybalion suggests that differences between manifestations of matter, energy, and mind are merely differences in rate of vibration. Here the text reveals its early 20th century origins. The language of vibration reflects contemporary enthusiasm for wave theory and electromagnetic phenomena. Physics had recently demonstrated that light behaves as both particle and wave, that matter and energy are interconvertible. The Kybalion appropriates this scientific vocabulary for metaphysical purposes, suggesting that spiritual and material realities differ only in vibrational frequency. From a rigorous standpoint, this conflation is problematic. The vibrations studied by physics are measurable, quantifiable phenomena, operating according to mathematical laws. The supposed vibrations of thought or spirit lack any such empirical foundation. The Kybalion engages in what might be called physics envy, borrowing scientific terminology to lend authority to essentially metaphysical claims. Jung showed more caution regarding such analogies between physics and psychology. While he corresponded with physicists like Wolfgang Pauli and entertained speculations about connections between quantum mechanics and synchronicity, he recognized the dangers of premature synthesis. The unconscious and the quantum realm might exhibit certain formal parallels, but these similarities do not constitute scientific proof of their identity or interaction. The principle of polarity states that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. This principle resonates deeply with Jung's psychology, which places enormous emphasis on the role of opposites in psychic life. The conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, animus and anima, all these paired opposites structure Jungian thought. For Jung, the tension between opposites drives psychological development. Consciousness emerges from the friction between conflicting tendencies. The goal of individuation is not to eliminate these opposites but to achieve their dynamic synthesis, what Jung called the transcendent function. Symbols arise precisely at the point where opposites meet, providing containers for their paradoxical unity. The Kybalion's treatment of polarity, however, differs in a significant respect. It suggests that opposites are identical in nature but different in degree, that they can be transmuted into one another through shifts in vibration. Heat and cold, love and hate, are presented as different points on the same continuum. This formulation tends toward a kind of reductionism, suggesting that apparent contradictions are merely matters of measurement. Jung's understanding proves more sophisticated. While he acknowledged the interplay between opposites, he insisted on their genuine distinction. The shadow is not simply the ego at a different frequency. It represents genuinely other contents that consciousness has rejected or failed to integrate. The reconciliation of opposites in Jung's system does not dissolve their difference but holds them in productive tension. The principle of rhythm declares that everything flows, out and in. Everything has its tides. This principle describes the oscillation between polarities, the pendulum swing between extremes. The Kybalion suggests that understanding this rhythm allows the adept to neutralize its effects through mental mastery, rising above the swing of the pendulum. Jung's concept of enantiodromia, borrowed from Heraclitus, expresses a similar insight. Psychic energy, like physical energy, follows cyclical patterns. Attitudes pushed to extremes tend to convert into their opposites. The overly rational person suffers eruptions of irrationality. Excessive extroversion eventually demands introversion. Recognizing these rhythms allows for more conscious navigation of psychic life. Yet Jung would likely reject the Kybalion suggestion that one can transcend rhythm entirely. For Jung, the psyche is inherently dynamic, necessarily moving between states. The goal is not to escape this movement, but to relate to it more consciously, to understand one's position within the cycle rather than being unconsciously driven by it. The principle of cause and effect asserts that every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. This principle affirms universal causation while suggesting the existence of different planes or levels of causality. The adept who understands higher laws can become a cause rather than an effect, escaping the determinism that governs those who remain unconscious. Jung's psychology navigates a complex middle ground regarding causation. He rejected strict mechanistic determinism while remaining committed to the intelligibility of psychic life. His introduction of the concept of synchronicity, a causal meaningful coincidence, represented an attempt to acknowledge patterns of connection that do not fit the cause and effect model. Yet Jung never abandoned causation entirely. He simply insisted that it does not exhaust the ways events relate to one another. The tension between determinism and freedom runs throughout depth psychology. To what extent are we products of our unconscious complexes, our childhood experiences, our archetypal inheritance? And to what extent can consciousness achieve genuine agency? Jung's answer emphasizes consciousness as an achievement rather than a given. Through the work of individuation, one gradually expands the sphere of conscious choice, though never completely escaping the influence of unconscious factors. The principle of gender maintains that gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. The Kybalion presents this not as biological sex, but as universal qualities of activity and receptivity, generation and gestation that operate on all planes of existence. This principle connects most obviously to Jung's concepts of animus and anima, the contrasexual archetypes within each individual. For Jung, the psyche contains both masculine and feminine elements regardless of biological sex. Integration requires acknowledging and relating to these contrasexual aspects rather than projecting them entirely onto external others. However, both the Kybalion and Jung's early formulations of gender psychology now appear problematic from contemporary perspectives. The rigid association of certain qualities with masculinity or femininity reflects cultural biases rather than universal truths. Activity versus receptivity, logic versus intuition, such pairs reveal more about patriarchal assumptions than about inherent psychic structures. Jung himself grew more nuanced in his later work, acknowledging the cultural construction of gender roles while maintaining that the psyche does contain complementary principles that might be symbolized through gender imagery. The key insight is that psychic wholeness requires integration of diverse qualities, whatever symbolic language one uses to describe them. The danger lies in reifying gender categories, treating culturally specific associations as if they were natural laws. Having examined the 7 principles critically, one can now address the central question: what is their psychological significance? If these principles do not describe objective features of reality, do they nevertheless illuminate something important about human consciousness and its relationship to the world? Jung would answer affirmatively. The Hermetic principles, like alchemical symbolism and mythological narratives, represent projections of psychic structures onto the cosmos. They tell us how consciousness spontaneously organizes experience, what patterns it perceives or imposes on reality. In this sense, they are profoundly true, though their truth is psychological rather than metaphysical. Consider the principle of correspondence. The human mind naturally thinks analogically, perceiving similarities and constructing relationships between different domains. This capacity for metaphorical thinking is not a cognitive error, but a fundamental feature of consciousness. Language itself rests on metaphor. Abstract concepts are invariably understood through concrete images. As above, so below captures this essential characteristic of human cognition. Similarly, the emphasis on polarity and rhythm reflects genuine features of lived experience. Consciousness operates through distinction and comparison. We know light through darkness, pleasure through pain, self through other. The psyche moves cyclically through different states, oscillating between activity and rest, engagement and withdrawal. Hermetic principles articulate these experiential patterns, giving them philosophical form. The danger emerges when these psychological truths are reified into metaphysical absolutes. The mind's tendency to perceive correspondences does not prove that the universe is structured according to the principle of correspondence. The psyche's experience of polarity does not demonstrate that all reality is inherently dual. Confusing psychological necessity with ontological fact leads to the kind of dogmatism that characterizes much esoteric literature. Jung's great achievement was to validate the importance of esoteric traditions while shifting their interpretive framework. Rather than defending these traditions as revelations of cosmic truth, he showed their value as maps of the psyche. The alchemist's quest to transform lead into gold symbolizes the psychological process of integrating shadow material and achieving wholeness. The Hermetic ascent through planetary spheres represents the expansion of consciousness through increasingly comprehensive perspectives. This psychological interpretation does not diminish the significance of esoteric traditions. In some ways, it enhances it. Understood as projections of the collective unconscious, these traditions reveal universal patterns of human experience. They show how consciousness has always grappled with fundamental existential questions: the relationship between mind and matter, the nature of transformation, the possibility of transcendence, the structure of the self. Both the Kybalion and Jungian psychology present paths of development, ways of moving from ignorance to understanding, from fragmentation to wholeness. For the Kybalion, this path involves mastering the 7 principles, learning to work with them consciously rather than being unconsciously subject to them. For Jung, the analogous process is individuation, the lifelong work of integrating unconscious contents and achieving psychic wholeness. The parallels are striking. Both systems emphasize the need for self-knowledge, the importance of recognizing one's position within larger patterns and cycles. Both suggest that consciousness can be expanded, that one can move from being a passive effect to becoming an active cause in one's own life. Both present this development as gradual, requiring sustained effort and often involving crisis and difficulty. Yet the differences prove equally significant. The Kybalion suggests a kind of mastery, an ability to rise above the laws that govern ordinary existence. The adept who truly understands the principles can neutralize rhythm, transmute polarity, and operate as a cause on higher planes. This vision tends toward the magical, implying powers that transcend normal human limitations. Jung's conception of individuation is simultaneously more modest and more demanding. Individuation does not grant escape from the human condition, but rather a more complete embrace of it. The individuated person does not transcend the unconscious, but achieves a better relationship with it, learning to recognize and integrate its contents. The goal is not power, but meaning, not control, but understanding. This difference reflects divergent attitudes toward the ego. The Kybalion, like much Western esotericism, tends to affirm ego strength and expansion. The practitioner develops will and concentration, learning to impose mental patterns on reality. Jung, by contrast, insists on the relativity of the ego. Consciousness is not the whole psyche, but merely its illuminated portion. Excessive ego identification leads to inflation and neurosis. Health requires acknowledging the unconscious as a legitimate source of knowledge and value. The Hermetic tradition, at least as presented in the Kybalion, risks what Jung called inflation, the identification of the ego with archetypal powers. When one believes oneself to be operating according to cosmic laws, when one claims mastery over fundamental principles, the ego expands beyond its proper bounds. This inflation is spiritually dangerous, cutting one off from genuine relationship with the unconscious and with others. Jung's approach emphasizes humility before the unconscious. The analyst does not master the psyche, but learns to listen to it, to recognize in dreams and symptoms the voice of something other than ego consciousness. Individuation requires the ego to relativize itself, to acknowledge its dependence on unconscious processes, and to serve the larger wholeness of the self rather than its own narrow interests. No examination of Hermetic thought and its relationship to psychology would be complete without addressing what Jung would call its shadow, the problematic elements that tend to be repressed or denied in enthusiastic appropriations of the tradition. The first shadow element is elitism. Both the Kybalion and much of the Hermetic tradition present themselves as knowledge for the few rather than the many. The very concept of initiates implies a hierarchy of understanding, those who possess secret knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. This elitism can foster spiritual pride and disconnection from common humanity. Jung grappled with this problem throughout his career. On one hand, he recognized that not everyone is prepared for or interested in the demanding work of psychological development. Individuation is not a mass phenomenon, but an individual achievement. On the other hand, Jung insisted that the capacity for psychological growth is universal, that the unconscious speaks to everyone through dreams and symptoms. The difference is not between those who have access to hidden knowledge and those who do not, but between those who attend to their inner life and those who ignore it. A second shadow element is the tendency toward magical thinking. The Kybalion, particularly in its discussions of mental transmutation and the mastery of natural laws, suggests abilities that verge on the magical. While the text carefully distinguishes true Hermeticism from vulgar magic, the line proves difficult to maintain in practice. Many readers approach such material seeking power rather than wisdom, looking for techniques to manipulate reality rather than understanding to navigate it more consciously. Jung warned repeatedly against the inflation that accompanies identification with archetypal images and powers. When one believes oneself to be wielding cosmic forces, when psychological insights become techniques for controlling others or manipulating circumstances, one has entered dangerous territory. The psyche contains enormous energy and can indeed affect one's life profoundly, but this is a far cry from the quasi-magical powers suggested by some esoteric literature. A third shadow element involves the appropriation and distortion of non-Western traditions. Both the Kybalion and Jung's work draw heavily on Egyptian symbolism and claim continuity with ancient Egyptian wisdom. Yet both interpret this material through distinctly Western and modern lenses, often ignoring or misunderstanding the actual historical and cultural contexts of these traditions. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus represents a Hellenistic synthesis, a product of cultural encounter between Greek and Egyptian traditions in the cosmopolitan environment of Alexandria. The wisdom attributed to him reflects this hybrid origin rather than pure Egyptian teaching. Similarly, Jung's interpretation of Egyptian mythology and symbolism, while psychologically fertile, often departs significantly from what historical and anthropological research reveals about ancient Egyptian religion. This appropriation becomes particularly problematic when Western esoteric traditions claim superior understanding of non-Western wisdom, suggesting that ancient peoples did not truly comprehend their own traditions until Western initiates or psychologists revealed their real meaning. Such claims reflect colonial attitudes and cultural imperialism, treating other traditions as raw material for Western synthesis rather than as complete systems in their own right. Having examined both the convergences and divergences between Hermetic philosophy and Jungian psychology, having acknowledged both the insights and the shadows of each tradition, what integrated understanding emerges? First, one must recognize that the Kybalion and Jung's psychology operate on different levels of discourse. The Kybalion presents itself as metaphysical teaching, making claims about the nature of reality itself. Jung's psychology, while drawing on metaphysical traditions, remains primarily phenomenological and therapeutic, concerned with how consciousness experiences reality rather than with what reality is in itself. This difference means that the two systems cannot simply be equated or merged. One cannot translate Hermetic principles directly into psychological concepts without loss or distortion. Each tradition has its own integrity, its own internal logic and purpose. The Kybalion aims at cosmic understanding. Jung aims at psychological integration. These goals overlap but are not identical. Second, Jung's psychological interpretation of esoteric traditions offers a powerful hermeneutical key for reading texts like the Kybalion. Rather than accepting or rejecting their metaphysical claims, one can ask what psychological realities they express. The 7 principles, understood as descriptions of how consciousness organizes experience, reveal profound insights into the structure and dynamics of the psyche. This approach allows one to take the Hermetic tradition seriously without requiring literal belief in its cosmology. The principles of polarity, rhythm, and correspondence describe real features of psychological experience. They articulate patterns that anyone who has engaged in genuine self-observation will recognize. Their value lies not in their metaphysical accuracy, but in their phenomenological precision. Third, both traditions point toward a reality that exceeds the ordinary ego's grasp. For the Kybalion, this reality is the all, the infinite mind that encompasses all manifest existence. For Jung, it is the self, the totality of the psyche that includes but vastly exceeds consciousness. Both suggest that ordinary awareness represents a limited perspective on a much vaster whole. This recognition of human limitation, paradoxically, opens the path to expansion. By acknowledging what exceeds our grasp, we become capable of relating to it. The Hermetic adept seeks alignment with cosmic principles. The individuating person seeks relationship with the unconscious. Both involve a kind of surrender, a willingness to be guided by something greater than ego consciousness. Finally, both traditions insist that understanding must be lived rather than merely conceptual. The Kybalion emphasizes practical application of its principles. Jung insists that psychological knowledge means nothing unless it transforms one's life. Ideas must become experience. Theory must be tested in practice. The measure of these teachings is not their logical coherence, but their capacity to facilitate genuine development. Before arriving at conclusions, one must address a fundamental epistemological challenge. How can consciousness know what transcends consciousness? Both traditions claim access to realities beyond ordinary awareness, yet this claim raises immediate questions of validation. The Kybalion appeals to initiatory tradition and direct experience. The principles are true because they have been transmitted from ancient adepts and can be verified through practice. Yet this proves insufficient from a rigorous philosophical standpoint. Traditions can transmit error as easily as truth, and subjective experience, however compelling, does not guarantee objective validity. Jung faced this problem more directly. He insisted that psychological statements are phenomenological descriptions rather than metaphysical claims. When he speaks of archetypes or the collective unconscious, He describes patterns observed in clinical work and cultural artifacts, not invisible entities in some Platonic realm. The psyche is real because we experience it, and its structures can be studied through their manifestations. Yet Jung sometimes made what appear to be ontological claims about the psyche itself. Is the collective unconscious a useful theoretical construct, or does it have objective existence? Jung's writings contain both positions, reflecting the inherent difficulty of speaking about psychic reality from within psychic reality. This epistemological instability affects how one should approach both traditions. Neither provides certain knowledge in the scientific sense. Both offer interpretive frameworks, ways of organizing and making sense of experience. The question is not whether these frameworks are absolutely true, but whether they prove fruitful, whether they illuminate experience in ways that facilitate understanding and development. From this perspective, the 7 Hermetic principles function as hermeneutical tools, rather than discovered laws. They provide lenses through which to view reality, each highlighting certain patterns and relationships. Whether these principles describe features of reality itself or features of how consciousness organizes reality becomes less significant than whether applying them yields insight. Both the Kybalion and Jungian psychology, despite their different starting points, share a fundamentally therapeutic orientation. Both aim at alleviating human suffering, though they understand the nature and source of that suffering differently. Examining this therapeutic dimension reveals another level of convergence between the two traditions. The Kybalion addresses suffering primarily as a problem of ignorance. Those who do not understand the 7 principles remain subject to forces they cannot comprehend or navigate. They are tossed about by polarities, swept along by rhythms, caught in mechanical chains of cause and effect. Knowledge of the principles offers liberation, allowing one to work with these forces consciously, rather than being unconsciously driven by them. This therapeutic model emphasizes empowerment through understanding. The adept who grasps how polarity operates can consciously transmute negative states into positive ones. The practitioner who understands rhythm can position themselves to ride its waves rather than being overwhelmed by them. Suffering diminishes as mastery increases, as one learns to align with cosmic principles rather than fighting against them. Jung's therapeutic approach proves more complex and arguably more profound. He locates the source of neurosis not in ignorance of cosmic principles, but in dissociation within the psyche itself. Suffering arises when consciousness becomes too narrow, when the ego identifies with only a partial perspective and represses or denies other aspects of psychic life. The shadow accumulates rejected content. Complexes form around emotionally charged material. The conscious personality becomes increasingly rigid and one-sided. Healing, from this perspective, requires not mastery, but integration. The neurotic must learn to acknowledge and relate to what has been split off, to recognize the shadow as part of oneself, to engage with anima or animus rather than projecting these contents onto others. This process is invariably difficult and painful, involving the dissolution of comfortable but limiting self-concepts. Yet through this dissolution and reformation, a more complete and authentic personality can emerge. The Jungian therapeutic process respects the autonomy of the unconscious in ways that Hermetic philosophy generally does not. Jung insists that the unconscious cannot be simply mastered or controlled. It must be listened to, negotiated with, given its due. Dreams bring messages that consciousness needs to hear, even when those messages prove uncomfortable or challenging. Symptoms point toward neglected aspects of life that demand attention. The unconscious is not merely an obstacle to be overcome, but a source of wisdom and vitality. This difference in therapeutic orientation reflects divergent understandings of the goal of human development. For the Kybalion, the goal is transcendence, rising above the laws that govern ordinary existence to operate from a higher plane. For Jung, the goal is wholeness, integrating all aspects of the personality into a functional totality. Transcendence in Jung's sense means not escape from the human condition, but its fuller realization. Yet both approaches recognize that genuine transformation requires more than intellectual understanding. The Kybalion emphasizes practice and application. Its principles must be lived to be truly known. Jung similarly insists that psychological insight without experiential integration remains sterile. The work of individuation cannot be accomplished through reading or even through analysis alone. It requires active engagement with one's life, with relationships, with creative expression, with the challenges that force consciousness to expand beyond its comfortable limits. Both traditions also acknowledge the role of crisis in development. The Kybalion speaks of the necessity of experiencing polarity to understand it, of navigating rhythm to master it. Jung explicitly recognizes that neurosis, while painful, often serves as the catalyst for psychological growth. The midlife crisis, the encounter with mortality, the breakdown of previous certainties, all these difficult experiences can initiate the process of individuation. Suffering, properly engaged, becomes the path to transformation, rather than merely an obstacle to be eliminated. The ultimate test of any philosophical or psychological system lies in its practical applicability. How do these teachings translate into lived experience? The Kybalion offers specific guidance for applying each principle. Understanding mentalism, one learns to work with mental images and attitudes. Grasping correspondence, one sees analogies between different levels of experience. Comprehending vibration, one can consciously shift energetic states. These applications often resemble modern cognitive reframing and emotional regulation, providing concrete techniques for managing mental states. However, the Hermetic approach can become problematic when it slides into naive idealism, the belief that positive thinking alone can transform material conditions. Reality pushes back against consciousness in ways that cannot be wished away. Jung's practical applications center on dream work, active imagination, and conscious-unconscious dialogue. The practitioner learns to attend to dreams as communications from the unconscious, to recognize recurring symbols, to engage with inner figures through imagination. Creative expression provides channels through which unconscious contents find conscious form. Both traditions recognize the necessity of sustained practice. The Kybalion presents its principles as subjects for lifelong study. Jung insisted that individuation unfolds across the entire second half of life. There are no shortcuts, no techniques that bypass the slow work of integration, yet practical application raises questions about social responsibility. Both traditions tend toward individualism, emphasizing personal transformation as primary focus. This has been criticized as potentially narcissistic, turning attention inward at the expense of engagement with social realities. Both traditions need supplementation by ethical frameworks that explicitly address collective well-being. The relationship between Hermetic philosophy and Jungian psychology illuminates a broader question about the value of esoteric traditions in the modern world. In an age dominated by scientific materialism and technological rationality, what role can these ancient wisdoms play? The answer lies neither in romantic revival nor in dismissive rejection. Esoteric traditions like Hermeticism contain genuine psychological insight, developed through centuries of introspective practice and symbolic meditation. They offer maps of consciousness that complement and sometimes surpass what modern psychology has achieved. Yet these traditions also contain much that is historically conditioned, culturally specific, and metaphysically questionable. Jung's great contribution was to provide a framework for engaging esoteric traditions critically, yet appreciatively. By understanding them as products of the collective unconscious, rather than revelations of cosmic truth, one can extract their psychological wisdom while avoiding their dogmatic pitfalls. The 7 Hermetic principles, the alchemical opus, the mystical ascent, all these become available as descriptions of psychic processes and potentials. This psychological interpretation does not exhaust the significance of esoteric traditions, but it provides a starting point that respects both modern critical consciousness and the depth of ancient wisdom. One need not believe that the universe is literally mental to recognize that mentalism captures something important about the primacy of consciousness in human experience. One need not accept that cosmic gender governs all reality to acknowledge that the psyche contains complementary principles requiring integration. The Kybalion and Jung's psychology, despite their differences, share a common conviction that human beings are capable of profound transformation, that consciousness can be expanded, that meaning can be found in the depths of experience. Both challenge the reductive materialism that would explain away consciousness and the shallow rationalism that ignores the irrational foundations of psychic life. Both insist that the examined life requires engagement with dimensions of reality that exceed ordinary awareness. In the end, the value of studying these traditions lies not in adopting them wholesale, but in allowing them to question our assumptions, expand our perspectives, and deepen our self-understanding. The Hermetic principles and Jungian concepts are tools for reflection, lenses through which to view experience differently. Used wisely, they facilitate the ongoing project of human becoming, the lifelong work of consciousness coming to know itself more fully. The student approaching these traditions must cultivate discernment, distinguishing genuine insight from comforting fantasy, psychological truth from metaphysical speculation. This requires intellectual rigor, historical awareness, and experiential testing. One must be willing to question both the traditions themselves and one's own motivations for engaging them. Above all, one must remember that knowledge of principles, whether Hermetic or psychological, is merely preliminary. The real work lies in application, in the daily practice of self-observation and integration, in the patient effort to become more conscious, more whole, more fully human. This work cannot be accomplished through reading alone, but requires the courage to confront one's own depths, to face the shadow, to dialogue with the unconscious. The Kybalion and Jung's psychology, properly understood, serve this work. They provide language and concepts for experiences that might otherwise remain inchoate. They offer encouragement that the difficult path of self-knowledge has been walked by others. They suggest that consciousness is not fixed but fluid, not limited but capable of expansion. In doing so, they contribute to the ancient project of human wisdom, the ongoing attempt to understand what it means to be a conscious being in a mysterious universe.